Grand Prix by just 1.4 seconds from Mika Hakkinen, a McLaren 1-2, a maximum 16 points in the Constructors' Championship.
That was David Coulthard winning the 2000 British Grand Prix. It was his 7th win of the season and his first in the year 2000, kick-starting his title charge to runaway leader Michael Schumacher. The next race will be held at the Circuit de Barcelona Catalunya in 2 weeks' time, so David decides he wants to go back to Monaco for a few days' rest. A plane was booked to take David, his girlfriend Heidi Wichlinski, and personal trainer Andy Matthews to Nice from Farnborough on the afternoon of Tuesday the 2nd of May. However, Coulthard decides he wants to go back to Monaco a little bit earlier in the day, but the plane he was scheduled to be booked on wasn't available for that flight time he wanted. So David requested that a new plane would be found for him for that time that he wanted to go for, and sure enough, a new plane was found, a lovely Learjet 35 that was actually owned by former Rangers chairman David Murray. It would be flown by Captain David Saunders and co-pilot Dan Worley. David shook hands with both pilots, boarded the plane, ready for takeoff. At 11:22 AM, the plane left Farnborough Airport, scheduled for Nice. Almost an hour into the flight, whilst cruising at 39,000 feet, David Coulthard heard a loud noise coming from the back of the plane. David was sat at the back of the plane looking into the cockpit, where he saw some red lights on the pilot's instruments. With David having some sort of flight experience himself, he knew that there was something drastically wrong. The crew looked around to see what the problem was, and it was discovered that the left engine had shut down. The crew shut off that engine and declared an emergency. The crew quickly requested an airport where the runway would be long enough for their plane to land on. Leon Settlers Airport was the closest with that length of runway, so the crew began the landing procedure whilst the plane was descending quite rapidly. While on final approach to Leon, David and his team were aware that the left-hand side engine had failed, but Coulthard was quite confident that the plane and the pilot were skilled enough to land with only one engine. Pilots are trained through every single scenario possible, and only a few weeks beforehand, both David and Dan had done this exact procedure before in the simulator. Just as the plane was about to touch down, it banged sharply to the left, the wing made contact with the ground, the plane had crashed and skidded across the grass where it stopped, and then suddenly the right hand side caught fire. The cockpit had been more or less detached from the fuselage, so David, Andy and Heidi all escaped the plane through the front of it, only with minor injuries. Once all three were out, David went back towards the plane to see if he could help the pilots. However, they would be sadly killed instantly on impact. A few hours later, after being checked by medics, David and his team were driven to Monaco from Lyon after they didn't want to fly the rest of the way. Once David arrived back at Monaco, the whole world's media caught attention of this crash and immediately went to his apartment to try and speak to David to give them some detail as to what happened to cause the crash. A few days later, David arrived in Barcelona for the Spanish Grand Prix. He made a quick statement to the media and then went straight back to racing. During the plane crash, David had suffered 3 broken ribs and was checked over by Professor Sid Watkins, who declared the Scotsman he was fit to race. People were stunned at the fact that David Coulthard was going to jump back in a Formula 1 car after going through what he went through during that plane crash. He qualified 4th on the grid and put in a very impressive performance during the Grand Prix, which included a brilliant overtake around the Ferrari of Michael Schumacher in Turn 1. He would finish on the podium in P2 behind teammate Mika Hakkinen, securing McLaren's second 1-2 in a row. An investigation into the crash was conducted, which DC himself cooperated in. When the final report was published, it was revealed that the number 5 bearing on the left-hand engine had failed, causing the engine to shut down. As the plane was landing, the cockpit voice recorder picked up co-pilot Dan Worley repeatedly saying that the plane is going too slow and is too low. It was also revealed that the right-hand side's engine power was significantly increased just before impact. In the conclusion part of the report, it said that the crew possessed the certificates, licenses and qualifications required to undertake the flight. The crew had had sufficient rest time before the flight. The aircraft was certificated and maintained in accordance with the regulations. While the aircraft was in cruise, the rupture of the number 5 bearing led to the failure of the engine. The left engine was shut down, the crew declared a mayday and undertook a descent following by an approach on one engine. The approach, including the final phase, was never stabilised. Just before the runway threshold, a significant increase in thrust was commanded on the right engine. The aircraft banked sharply to the left and touched the ground with its left wing before crashing and catching fire. And then the probable cause was that the accident resulted from a loss of yaw and then roll control, which appears to be due to a failure of monetary flight symmetry at the time of thrust increase on the right engine. The hastiness exhibited by the captain and his difficulty in coping with the stress following the engine failure contributed to this situation. It was a tragic accident that took the life of 2 pilots. David Saunders was 46 with almost 5,000 flight hours, whilst Dan Worley was 33 and had over 1,000 flying hours. Coulthard later praised both pilots for the way that they battled to save the plane and its passengers. David went on to win a further 2 more races in the year 2000 and finished 3rd in the overall standings. He would take his final win in Formula 1 in 2003 and retired from the sport in 2008. David, Andy and Heidi all went home that day. However, David and Dan sadly didn't. The actions did save the lives of David and his team. However, I think we can all agree that Dan and David should also be here so we can hail them as heroes.